in the frozen heart of a medieval winter, when survival demanded impossible decisions, a mother's love would be tested against the oldest law of all: stay alive, no matter the cost. Hello, dear listener. Tonight, I invite you to settle into your warmth and comfort as I tell you a story from a time long ago. A story both heartbreaking and profound, about the choices people made when the world offered them nothing but cold and hunger. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let us travel back together to a winter that changed everything. The winter of 1347 came early to the village of Thornbury, nestled in the rolling hills of what we now call the English Midlands. By the Feast of All Saints, the first snow had already fallen, and by the time December arrived, the cold had settled into the bones of the land like an unwelcome guest who would never leave. This was the year before the great pestilence would sweep across Europe, but the people of Thornbury did not know that yet. They knew only that this winter felt different, harder, more merciless, as though the very earth had turned its face away from them. Margaret of Thornbury was 32 years old that winter, though she often felt much older. Her hands, rough and calloused from decades of work, told the story of her life more honestly than any words could. She had been born in this village, the daughter of a freeman farmer who had managed to hold onto a small strip of land through luck and stubborn determination. Her childhood had been neither easy nor particularly difficult by the standards of her time. She had learned to card wool at 5, to spin at 7, and to work in the fields by the time she was 9. At 16, she had married Thomas, the son of the village blacksmith, and together they had built a life that was, if not prosperous, at least stable. Margaret had a face that people said was kind. Her eyes were brown, like the rich earth after rain, and her hair, which she kept bound beneath a simple linen kerchief, had once been the color of chestnuts but was now streaked with gray. She was not tall, but she carried herself with a certain strength, the kind that comes from years of bearing both physical burdens and sorrows. When she smiled, which was less often now than in her youth, small lines appeared at the corners of her eyes, lines earned from squinting into the sun during harvest, from laughing with her children when they were small, from crying in the darkness when she thought no one could hear. She had given birth to 6 children. 3 had survived past their first year. Her eldest, William, was 14 now, already apprenticed to his father in the blacksmith's trade. He had his father's broad shoulders and steady hands, and Margaret watched him with pride mixed with a mother's constant worry. Her middle child, Alice, was 11, a quick-minded girl with her mother's brown eyes and a curiosity that sometimes got her into trouble. She asked endless questions about everything: why the sky changed colors at sunset, why bread rose when you added yeast, why some people were rich and others poor. Margaret did not always have answers, but she loved the girl's spirit. And then there was Edmund. Edmund was 8 years old, and from the moment of his birth, Margaret had known he was different. He had come into the world a full month too early, so small that he fit in his father's 2 hands, and for weeks no one thought he would survive. But survive he did, through sheer determination or divine grace or simple luck, Margaret had never been quite sure which. As he grew, it became clear that Edmund would never be strong like his brother or quick like his sister. His left leg had never grown quite right, leaving him with a pronounced limp that made running impossible and walking an effort. His chest was narrow, and when winter came, he caught every cough and fever that passed through the village. He was small for his age, his face pale and often drawn with pain that he tried hard not to show. But Edmund had something the others did not. He had a gentle soul that seemed almost too pure for the harsh world into which he had been born. He loved watching the birds, knew each one by its song, and could sit for hours by the river, identifying the tracks of animals in the mud. He drew pictures in the dirt with sticks, surprisingly good pictures that captured the essence of a horse or a dog or his sister's laughing face. The village priest, Father Benedict, had taken a special interest in the boy, teaching him his letters, telling him that God had plans for even the weakest among his children. Margaret loved all her children fiercely, with a mother's whole heart, but Edmund occupied a special place in that heart, the place reserved for the most vulnerable, the one who needed her most. She had spent 8 years protecting him, nursing him through illnesses, carrying him when his leg hurt too much to walk, defending him from the village boys who sometimes mocked his limp. She had wrapped him in extra blankets on cold nights, given him the best portions of food when there was any to give, prayed over him more times than she could count. Thomas, her husband, was a good man but a practical one. He loved Edmund too in his way, but Margaret had seen the worry in his eyes as the boy grew. A blacksmith needed apprentices who could work the bellows, lift the heavy hammers, and stand for hours in the heat of the forge. William could do all these things. Edmund could barely carry a bucket of water from the well without stopping to rest. The trouble had begun in earnest the previous summer. The harvest had been poor, not catastrophically so, but enough to cause concern. The spring rains had come too late, and then the summer had been too dry, and the grain had grown thin and sparse in the fields. Margaret remembered walking through their small plot, running her hands over the wheat stalks that barely reached her waist, knowing already that there would not be enough. The village paid its tithes to Lord Ashford, who owned the land and the very lives of everyone who worked it, and after the tithes were taken, there was always less than people hoped. By autumn, the worry had become fear. The stores were low. Every family in Thornbury looked at what they had put away for winter and knew it would not be sufficient. And then the early snow came, and the fear became something closer to panic. Margaret would never forget the night in late November when Thomas had come home from the village alehouse with news that turned her blood to ice. He had sat down heavily on the bench by their small hearth, his face grave in the firelight, and told her what the men were saying. People were talking about the old ways, the ancient customs that had been practiced in times of greatest need, ways that had supposedly died out generations ago, but lived on in whispered stories and dark memories. "They're saying the winter will be too hard," Thomas had said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "That there isn't enough food. That families will have to make choices." Margaret had known immediately what he meant, though her mind had recoiled from the understanding. "No," she had whispered. "That's just old tales. Stories to frighten children." But Thomas had shaken his head slowly. "John Fletcher took his youngest daughter into the woods 3 days ago. She hasn't been seen since. And the widow Blackwell's grandson, the one who couldn't walk, his mother took him to her sister's village, she said, but no one believes it. There was no sister. There never was." The room had seemed to tilt around Margaret. She had heard the stories, of course. Every peasant in England had heard them. Tales from the truly desperate times, from the great famines of the past century, from years when the crops failed completely and people starved by the thousands. Stories of families who went into the woods and returned with fewer children than they had left with. Stories of elderly grandparents who walked away into the snow one night and were never sought. Stories of the weak, the sick, the ones who ate more than they could produce, who became expendable when survival itself was at stake. She had always thought they were just stories. Horror tales to make people grateful for what they had, to put their own hardships in perspective. The idea that people in her own village, people she knew, people who came to church and celebrated feast days and gossiped about their neighbors, the idea that these people would actually abandon their own children to the elements was unthinkable. And yet, as the weeks passed and the cold deepened and the food stores shrank, the unthinkable became thinkable. It became a whisper at the well where the women gathered for water. It became a sidelong glance between neighbors. It became a terrible arithmetic that everyone was doing in their heads. How many mouths to feed? How much food remains? Who cannot work? Who cannot contribute? Who will not survive the winter anyway? Margaret had watched Edmund more carefully after that conversation. She had seen how slowly he moved through the snow that was already piling up around their small cottage, how he shivered constantly despite the extra clothes she wrapped around him, how his breath came short and wheezing after the slightest exertion, how he ate so little, pushing food toward his siblings even though she could see his own hunger. And she had seen how Thomas watched him too. Her husband said nothing, but Margaret knew the calculations he was making. Edmund could not work in the forge. He required extra food, extra clothing, extra care. When he fell ill, which he did often, Margaret had to spend her time nursing him instead of working, carding wool, spinning thread, all the tasks that brought in a few precious pennies. In the brutal mathematics of survival, Edmund was a burden. A beloved burden, but a burden nonetheless. The winter deepened. By Christmas, the snow was knee-deep, and the cold was so intense that the water in their washing bucket froze solid every night despite being kept near the hearth. The food stores that had seemed worryingly low in November were now critically depleted. Thomas brought home less and less from his work at the forge. Fewer people had money for ironwork when they were deciding between tools and food, and they always chose food. Margaret began to ration more strictly. Breakfast became a thin gruel of oats boiled with water. Supper was bread, less bread each day, and sometimes a bit of cheese or dried fish, but more often just the bread. She gave the children her portions, claiming she had eaten earlier, and felt her own body grow lighter, her dresses hanging loose around her waist. She watched her children with the desperate attention of someone trying to memorize faces before a long journey, noting every detail. William's Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed his meager meal, trying not to show how hungry he still was. Alice's careful way of making her bread last, breaking it into tiny pieces and eating them slowly. Edmund's thin wrists protruding from his sleeves, the way his collarbone stood out sharply beneath his shirt. It was in the second week of January, during a particularly brutal cold snap, that Edmund fell ill again. It started with a cough, the kind Margaret had heard from him 100 times before, but this time it deepened quickly into something worse. His forehead burned with fever, and his breathing became labored, each breath a visible effort. For 3 days and nights, Margaret barely left his side. She brewed teas from their dwindling stores of dried herbs. She bathed his face with cool clothes. She held him when he coughed, his small body racked with spasms that seemed too violent for someone so fragile. On the 4th day, the fever broke, but Edmund did not recover his strength. He lay in bed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes too large in his thin face. He tried to smile when Margaret brought him broth, but she could see the exhaustion in every line of his small body. That night, after the children were asleep, Edmund in the bed, William on his pallet near the forge, Alice on her small mattress by the wall, Thomas came to Margaret where she sat by the dying fire. He sat beside her in silence for a long moment, and she knew what was coming. She had known it was coming for weeks. She had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and terrible. "Margaret," he said quietly, and the gentleness in his voice broke her heart. "We need to talk." "No," she said immediately, her voice barely a whisper. "No, Thomas. Don't say it. We have enough food for perhaps another month, if we're very careful," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "But it won't be enough to reach spring. Not for all of us, you know this. I know you know this." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "We'll manage. We always have. We'll—" "Edmund nearly died this week," Thomas interrupted, and there was pain in his voice too, genuine pain. "If there's another cold spell, another illness, he might not survive it anyway. And meanwhile, we're all growing weaker. William is still growing. He needs more food than we're giving him. Alice too. And you." He reached out and touched her hand, feeling the bones too prominent beneath the skin. "You're wasting away." "I won't do it," Margaret said, and her voice was steel now, forged in the heat of her desperation. "I won't take my child into the woods and leave him there. I won't. I don't care what others have done. I don't care if it means we all starve. I won't do it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The widow Hartley took her mother into the forest yesterday. The old woman could barely walk. She had been bedridden for months, eating food, contributing nothing. The widow came back alone. No one spoke of it. No one will speak of it. The widow is damned then, Margaret said flatly. Let God judge her. I will not do the same. Margaret. He is our son, Thomas. Her voice rose and she fought to control it, not wanting to wake the children. He is our child. We brought him into this world. We don't get to decide when he leaves it, not like this. Not by abandoning him in the snow to die alone and afraid. He's dying anyway, Thomas said, and the bluntness of it was like a physical blow. Can't you see it? Every winter is harder for him. Every illness takes more from him. He's 8 years old and weighs less than some children half his age. His leg will never heal. His lungs are weak. He will never be strong enough to survive on his own, never be able to marry and support a family. Never. Stop, Margaret's voice cracked. Stop. I know all of this. Do you think I don't see it every day? Do you think I don't know that he struggles? But he's alive, Thomas. He's alive and he feels and he thinks and he loves. He watches the birds. He draws pictures. He laughs when Alice tells him stories. He's alive, and while he's alive, he deserves to be loved and cared for. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of such weariness that Margaret felt her anger waver. He looked old at that moment, older than his 35 years. The responsibility of feeding his family, of keeping them alive through this merciless winter, was written in every line of his face. I love him too, Thomas said finally. You must know that. But love doesn't fill empty bellies. Love doesn't keep out the cold. And if we wait too long, if we try to keep all of us alive and fail, then we'll lose not just Edmund but William and Alice too. Maybe even ourselves. Is that what you want? To watch all of your children die because you couldn't make the choice that needed to be made? The question hung between them like smoke. Margaret felt tears on her face, hot against her cold skin. She thought of William, so steady and strong, with his father's quiet competence and his whole life ahead of him. She thought of Alice, brilliant and curious, who could perhaps make something more of herself than this hard life if she survived to adulthood. And she thought of Edmund, her sweet Edmund, who had fought so hard to live, who loved the world with such gentle joy despite how much pain it had brought him. I can't, she whispered. Thomas, I can't. Please don't ask me to do this. He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled softly, burning down to embers. Outside, the wind howled around their cottage, rattling the shutters, reminding them of the cold that waited just beyond their thin walls. Finally, Thomas spoke. Then I will do it. Margaret's head snapped up. What? If you can't do it, I will, he said. His voice was steady now, decided. I'll take him into the woods. You can stay here. You don't have to be part of it. But it must be done, Margaret, and it must be done soon, before we're all too weak to survive. No, she grabbed his arm. No, Thomas, you can't. I won't let you. He's my son. I won't let you. He's my son too, Thomas said, and there were tears in his eyes now as well. Do you think this is what I want? Do you think any father wants this? But I'm the head of this household, and it's my responsibility to ensure that as many of us as possible live through this winter. And if that means sacrificing one to save the others, then that's what I must do. That's what any father would do. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay beside Thomas in their bed, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on both of them like a physical thing. She listened to his breathing, knowing he was not asleep either, both of them lying in the darkness with their private griefs, separated by the terrible choice that had been made. In the morning, Thomas did not speak of it. He rose, dressed, ate his small portion of bread, and left for the forge as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. Margaret felt it in the very air of the cottage, a shift so profound it was like the world had tilted on its axis. She went through her morning tasks mechanically, stirring the fire back to life, preparing the thin gruel for breakfast, checking on Edmund, who was awake but listless, his fever gone but his energy gone with it. "Mama," he said softly when she sat beside him, "I still don't feel very well." "I know, my darling," she said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. His hair was fine and soft, the color of honey in sunlight. "You just need rest. You'll feel better soon." But would he? Would he have the chance to feel better? Or would Thomas come home tonight, or tomorrow night, or the night after that, and take Edmund by the hand and lead him out into the snow and... She couldn't finish the thought. Her mind recoiled from it, turned away, refused to imagine it. And yet she couldn't stop imagining it. Edmund's small hand in his father's large one. The walk into the woods. The moment when Thomas would tell him to wait here, that he would be back soon. The lie that every parent who had done this terrible thing must have told. Edmund stood alone among the trees as his father walked away, calling after him at first, then falling silent, then slowly understanding. The cold is settling in. The darkness is coming. The fear. Margaret pressed her hands to her face and wept silently, her body shaking with sobs she could not allow herself to voice. Alice found her that way an hour later and came to her immediately, putting her thin arms around her mother. "Mama, what's wrong?" the girl asked, her voice full of concern. Margaret pulled herself together with an effort. "Nothing, sweet one. Just worried about your brother. But he'll be fine. We'll all be fine." The lies were bitter on her tongue. The days that followed were the longest of Margaret's life. Each morning she woke up expecting Thomas to announce that today was the day. Each evening when he came home, she searched his face for signs of resolve or hesitation. But he said nothing. He went about his work, came home, ate his meager supper, spoke kindly to the children, and revealed nothing of what he intended. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Margaret found herself unable to leave Edmund's side for long. She sat with him constantly, memorizing everything about him. The way his fingers moved when he drew his pictures in the ash near the hearth. The sound of his laugh, rare now but still sweet when it came. The questions he asked about the world, showing a mind that was sharp even if his body was weak. The way he looked at her with complete trust, believing absolutely that his mother would keep him safe. That trust was what broke her. Every time Edmund looked at her with those trusting eyes, Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Because she couldn't keep him safe. Not from this, not from the decision that had already been made. On the 10th night after Thomas's declaration, as they lay again in the darkness, Margaret spoke. When, she asked simply. Thomas was silent for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then soon. Before the next storm. The weather has been clear these past few days, but I can feel another cold front coming. We need to do it before then, while he still has the strength to walk at least part of the way. Walk to his own death. That's what Thomas meant. Walk into the forest where he would be left. I want to go with you, Margaret heard herself say. No, that's not. I want to go with you, she repeated, her voice stronger now. If this is to be done, I will be there. He's my son. I won't let him go into the woods with only you. He should have his mother there. In the end, he should have his mother. She felt Thomas turn toward her in the darkness. Margaret, it will be harder for you if you come. Much harder. You don't need to. I need to, she said firmly. I need to be there. I need to hold him one last time. I need to tell him, her voice caught. I need to tell him I love him. I need him to hear it from me at the end. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then he simply said, 2 days from now. In the morning, after William leaves for the forge. We'll tell Edmund we're taking him to Father Benedict at the church, that the priest wants to see his drawings. He trusts the priest. He'll come willingly. The deception was necessary, Margaret knew, but it added another layer of horror to what they planned. They would use Edmund's trust, his innocent faith in the adults who were supposed to protect him, to lead him to his death. God forgive us, she whispered. God will have to forgive many parents this winter, Thomas replied. His voice was hollow. We're not the first. We won't be the last. The next 2 days passed in a blur of anguish. Margaret moved through her tasks like a ghost, barely aware of what she was doing. She found herself simply watching Edmund, drinking in the sight of him. She noticed things she had somehow never noticed before, or had noticed but not truly seen. The small scar on his left thumb from when he had cut himself on a sharp stone 3 years ago. The way his ears stuck out just slightly from his head, the freckle on his right earlobe. The precise shade of his eyes, not quite brown, not quite green, but something in between like moss on stone. She tried to give him extra food, but there was no extra food to give. She tried to keep him warmer, but they had no extra fuel for the fire. All she could do was hold him more often, sit beside him more constantly, and try to memorize the weight of him in her arms, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his small body against hers. On the evening before the day they had chosen, Edmund surprised her. He had been quiet most of the day, lying in bed, but as darkness fell and Margaret came to sit beside him, He looked up at her with those trusting eyes and said, "Mama, am I going to die?" Margaret's heart stopped. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then she managed to say, "Why would you ask that, my darling?" "You've been watching me," he said simply. "The way you watched baby John before he died. When he had the fever, and you knew he wasn't going to get better. You watch me like that now." Baby John had been her fourth child, born between Alice and Edmund. He had lived only 3 months before a fever took him. Margaret had thought Edmund too young then to remember, but apparently he had. "You're not going to die," she said, and the lie tasted like poison. "You've been ill, but you're getting better. You just need rest." Edmund studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Finally he said, "I heard Father talking to you. Late at night about food. About choices. I know things are hard, Mama. I know I eat food that William and Alice could have. I know I can't help like they can. I know I make everything harder." "No," Margaret said fiercely, pulling him close. "No, you don't make things harder. You're my son. You're my precious boy." Her voice broke. "It's all right, Mama," Edmund said softly against her chest. "I'm not afraid. Father Benedict says that heaven is beautiful. He says that the angels sing all the time, and there's no pain there and no cold. He says my leg will work properly in heaven. I could run there, couldn't I? Like William runs." Margaret couldn't speak. She could only hold him, her tears falling into his soft hair, her body shaking with the force of her grief. "I love you, Mama," Edmund whispered. "I love you and Father and William and Alice. I'm sorry I'm not stronger. I'm sorry I can't help more. But I love you all so much." "We love you too," Margaret managed to say. "So much, my darling. So much." They sat that way for a long time, mother and son, in the dim light of the dying fire. Outside, the wind began to pick up, and Margaret knew that Thomas had been right about the weather changing. Another storm was coming. Tomorrow would have to be the day. She didn't sleep at all that night. She lay beside Thomas and felt the hours pass like drops of blood from a wound, each one bringing them closer to morning, to the moment when they would have to act. She prayed, though she didn't know what she was praying for anymore. Forgiveness, the strength to go through with it. A miracle that would make it unnecessary. All of these, perhaps. Or none of them. When the first gray light of dawn began to show through the cracks in the shutters, Thomas rose. He dressed silently, methodically. Margaret watched him from the bed, then rose as well. Her hands trembled as she dressed, and she had to stop several times to steady herself. William left for the forge as he always did, carrying his small bundle of bread for his midday meal, unaware that this day was different from any other. Alice was still sleeping on her pallet. They would let her sleep, Margaret had decided. She didn't need to see this beginning. Margaret woke Edmund gently. "Come, my darling," she said softly. "We're going to take you to see Father Benedict. He wants to see those drawings you've been making. He thinks they're very clever." Edmund's face brightened slightly at the mention of the priest. Father Benedict had always been kind to him, had made him feel valued and important despite his limitations. He allowed Margaret to help him dress in his warmest clothes, his patched wool tunic, his worn cloak, his 2 large boots stuffed with rags to make them fit. Margaret dressed him slowly, savoring each moment. This was the last time she would ever help her son dress. The last time she would tie his cloak. The last time she would make sure his boots were secure. Each small act was an ending, and she performed them with a kind of desperate reverence. Thomas watched from the doorway, his face carved from stone. When Edmund was ready, Thomas picked him up. The boy was so light as a child half his age, and carried him toward the door. "Wait," Margaret said. She went to the small shelf where they kept their few possessions and took down a piece of bread. It was from their store for the next several days, but she didn't care. She wrapped it carefully in a cloth and tucked it into Edmund's cloak. "For later," she said, "when you're hungry." Edmund smiled at her, that sweet, trusting smile that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Thank you, Mama." They left the cottage as the sun was just beginning to rise, turning the snow-covered world into shades of gray and white and pale gold. The air was bitterly cold, cold enough that their breath came out in great white clouds. The snow crunched beneath their feet, and in the distance, Margaret could hear a crow calling, its harsh voice the only sound in the frozen morning. They did not head toward the church. Instead, Thomas turned toward the forest that bordered the village to the north. Edmund didn't seem to notice at first, but after a few minutes he said, "Father, the church is the other way." "We're taking a different path," Thomas said. His voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the strain beneath it. "A shortcut through the woods." The forest loomed before them, dark and deep. Ancient oaks and ash trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. Snow lay thick on the ground, undisturbed except for the tracks of animals, rabbits and deer, foxes and wolves. They entered the trees, and immediately the world became quieter, the sounds of the village fading behind them. Their footsteps were muffled by the snow. The light was dimmer here, filtered through the bare branches overhead. It was colder too, the wind blocked by the trees, but the chill seemed to rise up from the ground itself. Thomas carried Edmund deeper into the forest, following no path that Margaret could see. She walked behind them, her arms wrapped around herself, though whether from cold or from trying to literally hold herself together, she wasn't sure. She watched Edmund's small form in his father's arms, watched the way his head rested against Thomas's shoulder, the way his thin legs dangled. After perhaps 20 minutes, though time seemed to have lost all meaning, Thomas stopped in a small clearing. Ancient trees surrounded them on all sides, their trunks thick and dark with age. The snow here was pristine, unmarked by any footprints except their own. It was, Margaret thought with a kind of detached horror, a beautiful place. Peaceful. If one had to die, this would not be the worst place to do it. Thomas set Edmund down gently. The boy stumbled slightly, his weak leg making it hard to balance in the deep snow. He looked around the clearing with interest, not yet afraid, still trusting. "Why are we stopping?" he asked. "Is Father Benedict meeting us here?" Thomas couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Margaret with an expression of such anguish that she almost couldn't bear it. Margaret knelt down in the snow so that she was at eye level with her son. She took his small, cold hands in hers. "Edmund," she began, and her voice broke immediately. She had to stop, swallow, try again. "Edmund, my darling boy, I need to tell you something." Edmund looked at her, and she saw the moment when understanding began to dawn in his eyes. Perhaps he had known all along, on some level. Perhaps he had understood what was happening from the moment they turned toward the forest instead of the church. Or perhaps he read it now in his mother's face, in the tears that were streaming down her cheeks, despite the cold that froze them almost immediately. "You're leaving me here," he said softly. It wasn't a question. Margaret couldn't speak. She could only nod, her whole body shaking with sobs she was trying desperately to suppress. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because of the food. Because I eat food that others need. Because I can't work like William can. Because I'm weak." "No," Margaret choked out. "No, my darling, you're not." But Edmund shook his head. "It's all right, Mama. I understand. I told you, remember. I know things are hard. I know I make them harder. I don't want William and Alice to starve because of me. I don't want you and Father to starve. It's all right." The acceptance in his voice, the lack of blame, the understanding, it was more than Margaret could bear. She pulled him close, holding him with all her strength, feeling his small body against hers, so fragile, so precious. "I love you," she said against his hair, over and over. "I love you so much. You're my beautiful boy. You're so brave and kind and good. You're so much better than this world deserves. I love you, I love you, I love you." Edmund's arms came around her neck, thin as twigs. "I love you too, Mama. Don't cry. I'll be all right. Father Benedict says God takes care of the sparrows, and I'm more important than a sparrow, aren't I? So God will take care of me." The faith in his voice was like a knife in Margaret's heart. She held him tighter, trying to memorize the feel of him, knowing this was the last time, the very last time she would ever hold her child. Thomas knelt beside them, his own tears flowing freely now. He put his large, rough hand on Edmund's small head. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he said, his voice raw. "Braver than any knight, braver than any soldier. I'm proud to be your father. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Father," Edmund said, and his voice was so calm, so accepting, that it was almost unbearable. "You're doing what you have to do. I understand." They stayed like that for a few more minutes, the three of them kneeling in the snow in the clearing, holding each other. Margaret tried to make time stop, tried to hold on to this moment, but time is merciless and it would not be held. Eventually, inevitably, Thomas pulled away. "We have to go," he said quietly, "before someone sees us." Before he couldn't finish. Margaret nodded. She knew. If they stayed too long, their courage would fail. And if their courage failed, they would go back and then they would all starve. And Edmund would die anyway, but so would William and Alice, and possibly Margaret and Thomas themselves. The arithmetic was inescapable, brutal but inescapable. She kissed Edmund's forehead, his cheeks, his hair. She breathed in the smell of him, little boy sweat and wood smoke, and the herbs she had washed his hair with. She touched his face, his hands, committing every detail to memory. "Remember that I love you," she whispered. "Every moment of every day, for the rest of my life, I will love you. You will always be my son, always. Nothing can change that. Not this, not anything." "I know, Mama," Edmund said. And then, with heartbreaking practicality, "You should go now. Before it gets colder. Before you freeze too." Thomas helped Margaret to her feet. Her legs didn't want to work properly. Her whole body seemed to be rebelling against what she was doing, every cell screaming at her to stay, to not leave her child, to protect him the way mothers have protected their children since the beginning of time. But she turned away. She and Thomas turned away, and they began to walk back the way they had come, leaving Edmund standing alone in the clearing. Margaret made it perhaps 10 steps before she turned back. She had to see him one more time, just one more time. Edmund was still standing where they had left him, small and alone in the vast white clearing. But he wasn't crying. He had pulled the piece of bread from his cloak and was unwrapping it carefully. As Margaret watched, he broke off a small piece and held it up, and immediately a small bird, a sparrow of all things, fluttered down from a nearby branch and landed on his outstretched hand. Edmund laughed, a sound of pure delight, and the bird ate the crumb from his palm. Then another bird came, and another, drawn by the food and by something else, something about the boy that animals had always sensed. Edmund was feeding the birds, breaking his bread into tiny pieces and distributing it carefully, making sure each bird got some, his face alight with joy despite everything. "Mama, look," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. The sparrows came. Just like Father Benedict said. God sent them. Margaret couldn't move. She stood frozen, watching her son in perhaps the last happy moment he would ever have, surrounded by birds, smiling, finding joy even here, even now, even in this moment that should have held nothing but fear and despair. Thomas took her arm gently. "We have to go," he said. "Margaret, we have to go." She let him lead her away. She walked backward for as long as she could, watching Edmund until the trees obscured him from view. The last thing she saw was him kneeling in the snow, the birds fluttering around him, his face turned upward toward a shaft of sunlight that had broken through the clouds, illuminating him like a figure in a church window. Then he was gone, hidden by the forest, and Margaret and Thomas were alone, walking back toward the village, back toward their life, back toward the children they had chosen to save at the cost of the one they had left behind. They walked in silence. What was there to say? They had done the unthinkable. They had abandoned their child to die in the frozen woods. They were murderers now, as surely as if they had strangled him with their own hands. The fact that others had done the same, that this was happening in cottages and villages throughout the land this terrible winter, that they had done it to save their other children, none of that mattered. None of that absolved them. Nothing could absolve them. When they reached the edge of the forest, Margaret stopped. She turned back one last time, though she could see nothing but trees and snow and the gray sky above. "Goodbye, my darling," she whispered. "May God forgive me, because I will never forgive myself." Then she walked on, leaving her heart behind in the forest, and returned to the cottage where her other children waited, unaware of the price that had been paid for their survival. Alice was awake when they returned. She looked up from the small piece of sewing she was doing and asked brightly, "Where's Edmund? Did he go to see Father Benedict?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Thomas answered for her. "Yes," he said. "He's with the priest. He'll be staying there for a while. Father Benedict wants to teach him more letters." The lie came smoothly, and Alice accepted it without question, returning to her sewing. She didn't notice her mother standing by the door, staring at nothing, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. She didn't see the way her father sat down heavily on the bench and put his face in his hands. She was 11 years old and hungry and cold, and she had no reason to suspect that her brother was at that very moment dying alone in the forest, that her parents had become the kind of people who could do such a thing. The hours that followed were the longest of Margaret's life. She moved through her tasks mechanically, without thought. She prepared the midday meal, though eating made her feel sick. She carded wool, though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the tools. She stared at the walls, at the floor, at the fire, seeing nothing but Edmund's face, hearing nothing but his voice saying, "It's all right, Mama. I understand." That night, when the children were in bed, Margaret stood at the door of the cottage and looked out toward the forest. The storm Thomas had predicted had arrived. Snow was falling heavily, driven by a fierce wind. The temperature had dropped dramatically. She thought of Edmund out there in that storm, cold beyond imagining, frightened now perhaps, calling for her, wondering why she didn't come back for him. Or perhaps he was already gone, already freed from his suffering, his small body growing cold and stiff beneath the accumulating snow. She hoped he had died quickly. That was the only mercy left to hope for, that the cold had taken him fast, before the fear and loneliness became too terrible, before any animals found him. That he had simply grown sleepy, the way people did in extreme cold, and closed his eyes and not woken up. That it hadn't hurt too much. That he hadn't been too afraid. But she would never know. That was part of the horror of what they had done. They would never know how he had died, or when, or whether he had suffered. They would never be able to give him a proper burial, never be able to mark his grave, never be able to stand over him and say the prayers that would commend his soul to God. He would simply vanish, one more casualty of the winter, one more child who didn't make it to spring. Margaret went back inside and lay down beside Thomas. Neither of them spoke. What could they say? They had saved William and Alice. They had ensured their own survival. They had done what needed to be done. But they had killed their son. In the days that followed, Margaret discovered what it meant to live with the unbearable. She woke each morning and the first thought in her head was Edmund, and the knowledge of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. She went about her work and every task reminded her of him. Preparing food. Edmund had loved honey when they occasionally had it. Mending clothes. Edmund's small tunic still lay in the basket, waiting to be patched. Looking out at the snow, Edmund loved to watch it fall, said it was like stars coming down from heaven. Alice asked about her brother frequently at first. Why hadn't he come home yet? When would Father Benedict be done teaching him? Could they go visit him? Each question was like a thorn in Margaret's flesh. Thomas maintained the lie, saying the priest wanted Edmund to stay at the church, that he was learning so much, that he would come home when spring arrived. Eventually, Alice's questions became less frequent, and Margaret didn't know whether to be grateful or heartbroken that her daughter seemed to be forgetting about her brother. William, older and perhaps more perceptive, asked no questions at all. But sometimes Margaret caught him watching her with a strange expression, and she wondered what he suspected, what he knew. The village went on. Other children vanished that winter. The smith's youngest boy, the baker's infant daughter, the elderly woman who lived at the edge of the village with her daughter's family. No one spoke of it openly. There were quiet funerals for some, claiming to have died of natural causes. Others simply disappeared from conversation, as though they had never existed. It was a collective silence, a shared guilt that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone carried. Margaret found herself unable to pray. She went through the motions at church, kneeling when everyone else knelt, standing when they stood, but the words meant nothing to her. How could she pray to a God who allowed this? How could she ask for forgiveness when what she had done was unforgivable? Father Benedict gave his sermons about faith and endurance and God's mysterious ways, and Margaret sat in her pew and felt nothing but a vast, empty numbness. 3 weeks after they had left Edmund in the forest, the snow finally began to melt. The days grew incrementally longer. The worst of the cold passed. They had made it through the hardest part of winter. Their food stores, while still dangerously low, might just last until spring came and the first greens could be foraged from the fields. The arithmetic had worked. They had sacrificed Edmund, and in return, the rest of the family would survive. But the victory, if it could be called that, tasted like ash in Margaret's mouth. One morning in early February, Margaret woke from a dream of Edmund. In the dream, he had been standing in the clearing where they had left him, but he was warm and dry and smiling. The birds were all around him, not just sparrows but doves and songbirds of every kind, and they were singing. And Edmund was conducting them like a choir, his arms raised, his face joyful. "I'm all right, Mama," he had said in the dream. "I see. God sent the birds, just like Father Benedict said. I'm not alone. I'm never alone." Margaret woke with tears streaming down her face. It was just a dream, she knew. Just her guilt and grief creating comforting fantasies. Edmund wasn't all right. Edmund was dead, his small body lying somewhere in the forest, food for scavengers, rotting back into the earth. That was the reality. But something about the dream wouldn't leave her. She found herself unable to shake it, unable to stop thinking about it. By mid-morning, she had made a decision. "I'm going to the forest," she told Thomas. He looked up from the piece of iron he was working on. They were in the smithy, away from the children. "Why?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew. "I need to see," she said. "I need to know. I need to find him, Thomas. I need to bring him home, or at least mark where he is. Something. I can't just leave him there like he was nothing." "Margaret." "Don't try to stop me," she said. Her voice was steel. "I'm going. You can come with me or not, but I'm going." Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "We'll go together. After the children are asleep tonight." That evening, after William and Alice had gone to bed, Margaret and Thomas dressed in their warmest clothes and took a lantern and set out for the forest. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see by, and the snow, though melted in places, still covered much of the ground. Margaret's heart was pounding as they entered the trees. Part of her dreaded what they would find. Part of her desperately needed to know. They made their way to the clearing, Thomas leading the way from memory. It took longer in the dark, but eventually the trees opened up and they were there, in the place where they had left their son 3 weeks earlier. Margaret held up the lantern, its light casting long shadows across the clearing. She could see their footprints from that morning, still faintly visible in the compacted snow, leading to the center of the clearing and then away again. She could see the spot where Edmund had knelt to feed the birds, a small depression in the snow, but she could not see Edmund. There was nobody there, no sign of him at all except for those faint footprints and that small depression. No torn clothing, no bones picked clean by animals, no frozen form curled beneath the snow. Nothing. "Where is he?" Margaret whispered. She moved forward, holding the lantern higher, searching every corner of the clearing. "Where is he, Thomas?" Thomas was searching too, his face tense. "I don't understand. He should be here. Unless animals dragged him away, there would be signs. Blood tracks something." But there was nothing. It was as though Edmund had simply vanished. Margaret felt something strange stirring in her chest. Hope, she hardly dared to name it. Could he have walked out? Found his way somewhere? In his condition? In that storm, Thomas shook his head. He couldn't have made it far. And where would he go? Back to the village. We would have seen him. They searched the area around the clearing, expanding outward in circles, but found no trace of Edmund. No trail of footprints, no discarded clothing, no indication of which direction he might have gone. It was as though the forest had simply swallowed him whole. Finally, as the moon set and true darkness began to fall, they had to give up. They walked back to the village in confused silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret's mind was spinning. What had happened? Has someone else found Edmund? Had some other villager come across him and taken him in? But who? And why wouldn't they have returned him? Or was it possible? Margaret barely allowed herself to think it. Was it possible that Edmund had somehow survived? That despite his weakness, despite the storm, despite everything, he had found the strength to walk out of the forest. It seemed impossible, and yet he was not in the clearing. He was somewhere, or he had been somewhere at some point after they left him. Over the next several days, Margaret made discreet inquiries in the village. Has anyone seen a small boy, about 8 years old, limping? Have any travelers passed through? Has anyone heard of a child being found? But every inquiry led nowhere. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The mystery gnawed at Margaret. She returned to the forest twice more, searching different areas, but found nothing. It was as though Edmund had been lifted straight up into the sky and carried away. Father Benedict noticed her distraction. One day after Mass, he asked her to stay behind. "You seem troubled, Margaret," the priest said kindly. He was an old man, with white hair and gentle eyes. "Can I help in any way?" Margaret almost told him. The words were on her tongue. "We left Edmund in the forest. We abandoned him to die, and now he's gone and I don't know what happened to him." But at the last moment she couldn't. To speak it aloud would make it too real, would force her to confront what she and Thomas had done in the bright light of confession, rather than the shadows of secrecy. "I've been thinking about Edmund," she said instead, which was true enough. "I miss him." Father Benedict smiled. "He's a special child. I miss him too, his questions, his curiosity. The way he looked at the world." Margaret's throat tightened. "Father, do you really believe what you told him? About God taking care of the sparrows? About every creature being important to God?" The priest looked at her thoughtfully. "I do," he said. "I believe God sees every sparrow that falls. I believe he knows every hair on every head. I believe that nothing and no one is insignificant in his eyes, no matter how the world might judge their worth." "Even the weak," Margaret whispered. "Even those who can't work or contribute. Even those who seem like burdens." "Especially them," Father Benedict said firmly. "Christ himself said that the last shall be first, that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. The world measures worth by strength and productivity. God measures it by love and faith and the purity of the soul. Edmund has all of those in abundance." Margaret felt tears starting again. "Has," she noted. "Not had." The priest spoke as though Edmund was still alive. Perhaps he was. Perhaps somewhere, somehow, Edmund was still alive, and God really had sent angels or sparrows or some kind of miracle to save him. Or perhaps he was dead, and Father Benedict's words were just the comforting platitudes that priests offered to bereaved mothers, and Margaret was fooling herself with impossible hopes. She didn't know. She couldn't know. And that not knowing would haunt her for the rest of her life. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the land. By March, the snow had mostly melted, leaving the fields muddy and brown but no longer frozen. The first brave shoots of green began to appear in sheltered spots, wild garlic in the woods, new grass along the riverbank. The birds returned, filling the morning with their songs. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of food, of warmth, of renewed life. But for Margaret, spring brought no renewal. Each day that passed without Edmund was a day of quiet agony. She went through the motions of living, cooking, cleaning, spinning, caring for Alice and William. But part of her remained in that forest clearing, frozen in the moment when she had turned and walked away from her son. The extra food that Edmund's absence provided did indeed help the family survive. William grew stronger, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening as he moved further into young manhood. Alice's cheeks, which had been hollow and pale in the depths of winter, filled out and gained color. Thomas regained some of the weight he had lost. Even Margaret, despite her grief, found that her body slowly recovered from the worst of the starvation. They had survived. That had been the point after all. They had made the terrible choice, and it had worked. The mathematics of survival had proven correct. But the cost was incalculable. Margaret found that she could no longer look at Thomas the same way. When she saw him across the cottage, she saw the man who had carried their son into the forest to die. When he reached for her in the night, she felt the hands that had set Edmund down in the snow and walked away. She knew it was unfair. She had been there too, had made the same choice, was equally guilty. But knowing it was unfair didn't change how she felt. Something fundamental had broken between them that winter morning, something that might never be repaired. Thomas, for his part, grew quieter. He spent longer hours at the forge, coming home late, exhausted, speaking little. He was kind to William and Alice, patient with their questions and needs, but Margaret could see the weight he carried, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching, the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and simply stared at nothing, his face carved with grief. They never spoke of Edmund between themselves. His name became a silence in their home, a void that shaped all their conversations by its absence. Alice occasionally mentioned him. Edmund would have liked this, or I wish Edmund could see this. And each time Margaret felt as though a knife was being twisted in her chest. But she could not tell Alice to stop. To forbid the girl from mentioning her brother would be to kill him a second time, to erase him from the family as thoroughly as they had erased him from life. William never mentioned Edmund at all. Margaret sometimes wondered what he thought, what he suspected. He was old enough to understand the realities of the winter they had endured. He must have noticed other children who had disappeared from the village. He must have heard the whispers, seen the haunted looks on other parents' faces. Did he know what had happened to his brother? Did he lie awake at night and imagine it? Did he feel grateful that he had been the strong one, the useful one, the one chosen to live? Margaret hoped not. She hoped William's silence was simply the silence of a boy becoming a man, learning to keep his thoughts to himself, not the silence of terrible knowledge. As spring turned to summer, Margaret found herself drawn again and again to the forest. She told herself she was foraging, looking for mushrooms, gathering wild herbs, checking the nut trees to see how the harvest might be in autumn. But in truth, she was searching, always searching, for some sign of Edmund, for some clue about what had happened to him, for some way to make sense of the fact that his body had never been found. She explored every part of the forest she could reach, ranging farther than she ever had before. She looked in hollow trees, under fallen logs, in dense thickets where a small boy might have crawled seeking shelter. She found the remains of animals, a deer that had died in the winter, picked clean by scavengers, a fox frozen in its den, but never any sign of Edmund. The mystery consumed her. At night, she lay awake constructing theories. Perhaps a merchant had been traveling through the forest and had found Edmund and taken him to another town, another village far from here. Perhaps a hermit lived deep in the woods and had rescued him. Perhaps, and this was the theory she returned to most often, though she knew it was the least likely, perhaps Edmund had somehow found the strength to walk out of the forest on his own, had made his way to some distant place where he was even now alive, growing, living the life they had tried to take from him. She knew these fantasies were just that, fantasies. The rational part of her mind knew that Edmund had almost certainly died in that clearing or soon after, and that animals had scattered his remains so completely that nothing could be found. But the heart doesn't listen to rationality. The heart needs hope, even false hope, to keep beating. In June, something happened that shook the fragile equilibrium Margaret had achieved. A traveling friar came through the village, one of those wandering holy men who moved from place to place, preaching and begging for alms. He was thin and weather-beaten, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He preached in the village square about sin and redemption, about the trials God sent to test his people, about the need for confession and penance. His words were fire and brimstone, full of visions of hell and damnation. Most of the villagers listened politely, but without much real interest. They had heard such sermons before, from traveling preachers who came and went with the seasons. But then the friar said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I have traveled far," he proclaimed, his voice ringing across the square. "I have seen the devastation of this past winter. I have seen villages where half the people died of starvation. I have seen parents eating their own children to survive. I have seen the depths to which humanity can sink when pressed by desperation." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. Margaret felt as though he was looking directly at her, though she knew that was impossible. He couldn't know. No one knew except her and Thomas. "But I have also seen miracles," the friar continued. "In the darkest moments, when all hope seemed lost, I have seen God's hand at work. I have seen the innocent preserved. I have seen angels walking among us." He went on to tell a story then, a story that made Margaret's heart begin to pound so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "In a forest north of here," the friar said, "I met a child. A boy no more than 8 or 9 years old, living alone in the woods. He had been there since winter, he told me, left by his parents who could not feed him. By all logic, by all natural law, he should have died within days. The cold alone should have killed him. The hunger, the predators, the elements, any of these should have taken him." The friar's voice rose. "But he lived. He still lives. He told me that on the first day when he was alone and afraid, birds came to him. Sparrows and doves and other small creatures. They brought him seeds and berries. They led him to a hollow tree where he could shelter. At night," he said, "he felt warmth around him, though there was no fire. He felt presence, though he could see nothing. Angels, he believes, sent by God to preserve him." Margaret couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt around her. It couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be. And yet, "The boy has the mark of God upon him," the friar continued. "I have taken him to a monastery, 3 days' journey from here, where the brothers will care for him and teach him. They believe he may have a holy calling, that he may have been preserved for some divine purpose. They are calling him Edmund the Blessed, Edmund of the Birds." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Edmund, her name is Edmund. It had to be. How many boys named Edmund had been left in the forest last winter? How many had the particular story of the birds? She pushed through the crowd, her hands shaking, her voice barely working. "This boy," she managed to say to the friar. "This Edmund. Where did you find him? Which forest? Which monastery?" The friar looked at her with those penetrating eyes. "Why do you ask, woman?" "Lie. I know a family," Margaret stammered. "A family who lost a son named Edmund. They would want to know if he lives." It was not quite a lie. She did know such a family. She was such a family. The friar studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "The boy was found in the great forest north of here, near the old Roman road. He is now at St. Cuthbert's Abbey, in the hills beyond Thornwood. If this family you speak of wishes to see him, they may travel there, but they should know the boy has no memory of his life before the forest. The brothers say this is sometimes God's mercy, to let the abandoned forget those who abandoned them. No memory." The words were both a relief and a fresh wound. If Edmund truly remembered nothing of his old life, then he did not remember Margaret and Thomas leaving him. He did not remember the betrayal, the abandonment, the choice they had made. But he also did not remember being loved. Did not remember his mother holding him, his father carrying him, his siblings playing with him. I did not remember the 8 years before that terrible morning. Margaret thanked the friar with words that seemed to come from someone else's mouth. She walked home in a daze, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Edmund really be alive? After all these months of searching, of wondering, of torturing herself with questions, could the answer be that simple? That he lived, that God or angels or sheer chance had preserved him, that he was safe in a monastery learning to be a monk. She had to tell Thomas. She had to tell him, and they had to go to this monastery to see for themselves whether this boy was truly their son. And if he was, then what? Did they have any right to reclaim him? They had abandoned him. They had left him to die. They had chosen his death over his life. What right did they have now to appear and disrupt whatever new life he had found? Thomas was at the forge when Margaret found him. She pulled him aside, away from William and the other apprentice, and told him what the friar had said. She watched the emotions play across his face: disbelief, hope, fear, something that might have been joy or might have been grief. She couldn't tell. "It might not be him," Thomas said finally, but his voice shook. "Edmund is a common name. Many boys were left in forests last winter. It could be any of them." "The birds," Margaret insisted. The friar said the boy spoke of birds that came to him, that brought him food. "You saw him, Thomas. You saw him feeding the birds with the last of his bread before we left. You saw it." Thomas's face crumpled. "I saw it," he whispered. "God help me. I saw it and I still walked away." "We have to go," Margaret said. "We have to go to this monastery. We have to see if it's him." "And if it is?" Thomas asked. "What then, Margaret? Do we tell him who we are? Do we explain to him that we're the parents who left him in the forest to die? Do we ask him to forgive us, to come home with us, to pretend that none of it ever happened?" Margaret had no answer. She had no plan beyond the desperate need to see Edmund, to know for certain whether he lived. Everything beyond that was a darkness she couldn't penetrate. They made arrangements to leave 2 days later. Thomas told the master blacksmith he needed time away for family business. Margaret told Alice and William they were making a journey to visit a distant relative. The lies came easier now, after so many months of lies and omissions. The journey to St. Cuthbert's Abbey took 4 days on foot, following the directions the friar had provided. They walked through the summer countryside, green and abundant after the harsh winter, past fields where the grain was growing tall and healthy, past villages that looked prosperous and peaceful. The world had recovered from winter's deprivations. Life had returned. Only Margaret and Thomas carried winter still inside them, cold and unforgiving. The monastery sat on a hill overlooking a river valley, its stone walls golden in the afternoon sun. It was a beautiful place, peaceful, with gardens and orchards and the sound of bells marking the hours. Monks moved quietly about their business, their habits making them look like shadows against the bright stone. Margaret and Thomas approached the gate nervously. A young brother answered their knock and asked their business. "We've come to see a boy," Thomas said. "A boy named Edmund. Edmund of the birds," the friar called him. The monk's face lit up. "Ah, yes. Young Edmund. He's a remarkable child. Has God sent you to him? Are you family? The question hung in the air. Margaret felt Thomas looking at her, waiting for her to answer. We knew him, she said carefully. Before he came here. We heard he had been found, and we wanted to see him. To make sure he was well. It was not an answer exactly, but the monk seemed satisfied. Come with me, he said. He's in the scriptorium. Brother Anselm is teaching him his letters. He learns very quickly, our Edmund does. The abbot says he has a gift. They followed the monk through cool stone corridors, past chapels and dormitories, until they came to a large room filled with slanted desks and shelves of manuscripts. The smell of ink and parchment filled the air. Several monks sat at the desks, copying texts with careful precision. And at a desk near the window, his small form bent over a piece of parchment, sat Edmund. Margaret's knees nearly gave out. It was him. Even from behind, even after all these months, she knew him instantly. The shape of his head, the way his shoulders curved, the thinness of his arms. Her son. Her child alive. Edmund was carefully forming letters on the parchment. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration the way he always did when working on something difficult. An elderly monk sat beside him, offering gentle corrections and encouragement. Edmund, the young monk called softly. You have visitors. Edmund looked up, and Margaret saw his face for the first time in 7 months. He had changed. His face was slightly fuller, healthier than it had been that terrible winter. His eyes were clear and bright. He looked impossibly happy. He studied Margaret and Thomas with polite curiosity but no recognition. His gaze traveled over their faces, their clothes, their hands, and Margaret saw nothing in his expression that suggested he knew them at all. Hello, Edmund said politely. I'm Brother Edmund. Well, not really a brother yet, just Edmund. But someday, if I work hard, I'll take vows. He smiled, and it was his smile, the same sweet smile he had always had. Brother Anselm is teaching me to read and write Latin. Would you like to see? He held up his parchment proudly, showing them the carefully formed letters. Margaret couldn't see them. Her eyes were too full of tears. It's beautiful, she managed to say. Her voice sounded strange, choked. Edmund beamed. I'm getting better. At first my letters were all crooked, but Brother Anselm is very patient. He says patience is a virtue, and God rewards those who persist. Thomas cleared his throat. Do you remember anything? Before you came here? Edmund's face grew thoughtful. Not really, he said. I remember the forest. I remember being cold and scared. I remember birds, lots of birds. They helped me. And then Brother Peter, that's the friar who found me. He brought me here. The brothers say I must have been very brave to survive in the forest alone, but I don't remember being brave. I just remember the birds and feeling like someone was watching over me. Someone kind. He paused, his expression turning sad for just a moment. Sometimes I dream about people. a woman with gentle hands, a man with a deep voice. Other children, but Brother Anselm says those might just be wishes, not memories. He says many orphans dream of families they never had. Orphans. The word was like a blade. Edmund believed himself an orphan, a child without family, without parents. He had no idea that his parents stood before him now, their hearts breaking, their guilt a physical weight crushing them. "Do dreams make you sad?" Margaret asked softly. Edmund considered this. "Sometimes," he admitted. But Brother Anselm says sadness can be offered to God, that suffering has meaning when we give it to Him. And I'm happy here. The brothers are kind. I learn new things every day. I help in the garden. I can't do heavy work because of my leg, but I can plant seeds and pull weeds and collect eggs from the chickens. The chickens like me. The birds do too. Sometimes they eat right from my hand." He said this last part with obvious pride, and Margaret remembered him in the clearing, surrounded by sparrows, his face lit with joy even in that terrible moment. "That's a wonderful gift," Thomas said. His voice was rough with emotion. "To have creatures trust you like that." Brother Anselm says St. Francis was the same way, Edmund said. He could talk to animals. I can't talk to them exactly, but I feel like I understand them sometimes. Like I know what they need. He looked between Margaret and Thomas curiously. "Did you know me before? Is that why you came?" The question was direct, innocent. Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. This was the moment. They could tell him. They could say, "Yes, we're your parents. We left you in the forest to die, but now we want you back." They could reclaim him, take him home, and try to rebuild what they had destroyed. But looking at Edmund, at his clean face, his bright eyes, his obvious contentment, Margaret suddenly knew they couldn't. They had no right. They had given up that right when they walked away from him in the forest. He had a life now, a good life, better perhaps than anything they could offer him. He was learning to read and write, rare skills for a peasant child. He was warm and fed and valued. He was happy. What would they bring him back to? A cottage where his presence would be a constant reminder of their sin. A village where people knew he had been abandoned. A life of hard labor that his weak body could barely manage. Shame and guilt and the knowledge of what his parents had done. No. They had lost the right to be his parents. That right had died in the forest clearing the day they left him there. "We knew someone who knew you," Margaret said finally, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "A family who wondered what had become of you. They asked us to find you if we could, to make sure you were safe and cared for." "Oh," Edmund said. His face showed a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, hope. "Are they? Will they come to see me?" "They can't," Thomas said gently. "But they wanted you to know that they think of you. That they," his voice broke, "that they love you. That they always will." Edmund smiled a little sadly. "That's kind. Will you tell them I'm doing well? That I'm happy here? that the brothers take good care of me. We will, Margaret promised. We'll tell them everything. We'll tell them you're safe and learning, and surrounded by people who value you. We'll tell them about the birds and your letters and how brave you are. I'm not really brave, Edmund said modestly. But thank you. Would you like to stay for Vespers? The singing is beautiful. You can hear it all through the valley. They stayed for Vespers. They sat in the chapel and listened to the monks chant their evening prayers, their voices rising and falling in ancient harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human world. They watched Edmund among the other brothers, his small form nearly lost in the borrowed habit they had given him, his voice joining the others in the Kyrie eleison. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. Lord have mercy. And Margaret prayed, truly prayed for the first time since that winter morning, that God would have mercy. Not on her, not on Thomas. They deserved none. But on Edmund, on this child who had been abandoned and left to die and had somehow, impossibly lived. This child who had forgotten the people who failed him and found new people who wouldn't. This child who fed birds and learned Latin and smiled with genuine joy. Let him be happy, she prayed. Let him have the life we couldn't give him. Let him never remember what we did. Let him grow up here, safe and valued and loved. And let us carry the memory for both of us. Let us carry the guilt and the grief so that he doesn't have to. After Vespers, they said goodbye. Edmund shook their hands solemnly and asked them to give his regards to the family who had inquired about him. Tell them I'm grateful, he said, for thinking of me, for caring enough to find out what happened to me. We will, Margaret said. And then, because she couldn't help herself, she pulled him into a brief embrace. He stiffened slightly, surprised. The monks probably weren't demonstrative, but he didn't pull away. For just a moment, Margaret held her son again, felt his small body against hers, breathed in the smell of him. Different now, soap and incense instead of wood smoke and herbs, but still Edmund underneath it all. God keep you, she whispered into his hair. And you, he replied politely, pulling back with a smile. And then they left. They walked out of the monastery, down the hill, back toward the road that would take them home. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was too much to say and no words adequate to say it. Finally, as the sun was setting and they were making camp for the night, Thomas broke the silence. We did the right thing, he said. Not telling him. Letting him believe he's an orphan. It's better for him. I know, Margaret said. He's happy. Safe. He has a future here he never could have had with us. I know. We can't change what we did. We can't undo it. But at least he lived. Against all odds, he lived. I know, Margaret said again. And then more quietly, but we still did it, Thomas. We still left him there to die. The fact that he survived doesn't absolve us. It doesn't make what we did any less terrible. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then, no. It doesn't. Nothing ever will. They sat in the gathering darkness, two people bound together by blood and marriage and shared guilt, and watched the stars come out one by one. Somewhere in a monastery 3 days' journey away, their son was probably watching the same stars, not knowing that his parents were out there thinking of him, mourning him, loving him from a distance they could never bridge. Margaret thought of the sparrows Edmund had fed in the clearing, the birds that had, according to his own account, helped keep him alive through that terrible winter. She thought of Father Benedict's sermon about God seeing every sparrow that falls, knowing every creature, valuing even the weakest and smallest. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps there was a God who watched over abandoned children and sent birds to feed them and angels to warm them and friars to find them. Perhaps there was meaning in Edmund's survival, purpose in his suffering, grace in his forgetting. Or perhaps it was all just chance, a series of unlikely events that happened to align in a way that preserved one small life that should have ended. Perhaps the universe was as cold and merciless as that winter had been, and Edmund's survival was simply an anomaly, a statistical improbability that meant nothing at all. Margaret didn't know. She would never know. But she found that she wanted to believe in Father Benedict's God, in the God who valued sparrows and crippled children, and all the weak and forgotten ones that the world discarded. She wanted to believe that Edmund's life had meaning beyond mere survival, that he had been preserved for some purpose, that his suffering had not been pointless. Because if she couldn't believe that, then what they had done was simply monstrous, and she was simply a monster, and there was no redemption possible in this world or the next. They returned to Thornbury 5 days later. Alice and William asked about their journey, and Margaret told them they had visited a distant cousin, that all was well, that the trip had been necessary but uneventful. More lies. The lies were becoming easier and easier, a smooth protective shell around the terrible truth. Life resumed its normal rhythms. Summer turned to autumn. The harvest was good that year, abundant after the privations of the previous season. The food stores were filled. People began to regain the weight they had lost, to smile more easily, to speak less fearfully of the future. The terrible winter of 1347 began to recede into memory, becoming just another hard season that had been endured and survived. But Margaret carried that winter with her always. She thought of Edmund constantly, not as he had been when they left him, small and frightened in the clearing, but as he was now. Growing up in the monastery, learning his Latin, feeding his birds, finding his place in a world that valued him for who he was rather than what he could produce. She imagined him taking his vows someday, becoming Brother Edmund in truth, living out his life in service and prayer and quiet contentment. It was a good life, better than the one she could have given him. She told herself this often, and most of the time she even believed it. Thomas, too, seemed to find some measure of peace in knowing that Edmund lived. He never spoke of it directly, but Margaret noticed small changes. He was gentler with William, quicker to praise, slower to criticize. He spent more time with Alice, teaching her things, answering her endless questions with patience. It was as though he was trying to be the father to them that he hadn't been able to be to Edmund, as though he was attempting to atone for one child by being better to the others. Margaret understood. She was doing the same thing. Loving the children she had kept by remembering the one she had given up, making sure William and Alice knew they were valued not for their strength or usefulness, but for themselves. Trying to be the mother she wished she had been brave enough to be when it mattered most. Years passed. William married and took over the forge completely when the master blacksmith died. He had children of his own, strong, healthy children, who never knew they had an uncle named Edmund, who had been left in a forest to die. Alice married a merchant's son from a neighboring village and moved away. She wrote letters occasionally, talking about her life, her children, the business her husband was building. Neither child ever asked what had happened to Edmund. Perhaps they had forgotten him. Perhaps they had simply accepted the story about him staying with Father Benedict, and then, later, the quiet understanding that he had died of an illness. Margaret and Thomas never corrected this assumption. Thomas died in the winter of 1361, 14 years after that terrible morning in the forest. He went quickly, a fever that took him in a matter of days. On his last night, delirious with the illness, he called for Edmund. "Tell him I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, his hand gripping Margaret's with surprising strength. "Tell him we loved him. Tell him we thought we were choosing life for the others, but we chose death for him, and it was wrong. Tell him," he dissolved into coughing. "I'll tell him," Margaret promised, though she knew she never would. Edmund, if he still lived, and she had to believe he did, didn't need to know. Didn't need to carry the burden of his parents' guilt. Thomas died that night, and Margaret wept for him, for the good man he had been, for the impossible choice they had faced together, for the way that one terrible decision had shadowed the rest of his life. She had the priest give him last rites and a proper burial. She mourned him honestly, without pretense, and tried to remember him as he had been before that winter before the choice, when their lives had been hard but unmarked by the kind of guilt that never heals. Margaret lived another 20 years, growing old in the cottage where she had raised her children, watching her grandchildren grow, helping where she could, slowly becoming one of those ancient women who sit by the fire and tell stories of the old days. But she never told the true stories, the ones that mattered most. She never spoke of the winter of 1347, of the choice she and Thomas had made, of the son they had left in the forest. She did, however, make a pilgrimage. Once a year, every year, she walked to St. Cuthbert's Abbey. She told people she was going to pray, to light a candle for her husband's soul, and this was partly true. But mostly she went to catch a glimpse of Edmund if she could. She never spoke to him. She stayed in the back of the chapel during services, hidden among the other pilgrims and supplicants. But she watched him. I watched him grow from a boy into a young man, into a middle-aged monk. Watched his hair go gray at the temples. Watched him move through the monastery with quiet confidence, sometimes leading prayers, sometimes teaching novices, sometimes simply tending his beloved birds. He looked happy. That was what Margaret told herself every time she made the journey. He looked content, fulfilled, at peace with his life and his place in the world. He had found meaning and purpose. He had survived not just the abandonment but the trauma of it, had built a good life from the ruins of what should have been his death. And if sometimes she saw a shadow cross his face, a moment of sadness or loneliness or longing for something he couldn't name, she told herself it was her imagination. Told herself she was projecting her own grief onto him. Told herself that he was fine, that he had been saved, that the terrible thing she and Thomas had done had somehow, impossibly, resulted in something better than what would have been. In the spring of 1381, Margaret made her final pilgrimage to the abbey. She was 76 years old, frail but still alert, her body bent with age but her mind clear. She sat in the back of the chapel and watched Edmund, now Brother Edmund in truth, now 52 years old, lead the morning prayers. His voice was still gentle, still carrying that quality of kindness she remembered from when he was a child. He moved slowly, his limp more pronounced now with age, but with a kind of dignity. When he turned to give the blessing, his face was serene, lined with age but unmarked by bitterness or anger. He had lived, not just survived but lived, had built a life of meaning and service, had found a place where his weaknesses didn't matter, where his gentleness was valued, where he could feed his birds and teach his novices and pray his prayers and be, simply, himself. It wasn't the life Margaret had imagined for him when he was born. It wasn't the life she had planned during those 8 years when she had protected him and nursed him and loved him with all her fierce mother's heart. But it was a good life, perhaps even a better life than the one he would have had if they had kept him, if they had all starved together that winter, or if he had survived only to grow up knowing he was a burden, knowing he had nearly been the death of his family. After the service, Margaret approached one of the younger monks. "Brother Edmund," she said, her voice shaky with age, "the one who leads the prayers. Could you tell me, is he well? Is he happy here?" The young monk smiled. "Brother Edmund, oh yes, he's very well. He's our sub-prior now, you know, in charge of the novices. The young brothers love him. He's patient and kind, never harsh even when they make mistakes. And his work with animals is extraordinary. Birds will land on his shoulders, eat from his hands. Some say he has the gift of St. Francis. Does he ever speak of his past? His family?" The monk shook his head. "He has no family that we know of. He was found in the forest as a child. A miracle, really, that he survived. But he says he remembers nothing before coming here. Brother Anselm, he's passed now, God rest him, used to say it was God's mercy to let Edmund forget whatever pain had come before." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "God's mercy." She left the abbey and began the long walk home. She knew somehow that this would be her last pilgrimage. Her body was too tired, too worn. The journey that had once been manageable was now nearly impossible. But she had seen Edmund one last time. I had seen him happy and useful and valued. Had seen that the small boy who had fed the sparrows in the clearing, had grown into a man who still fed them, who still found joy in God's smallest creatures, who still carried within him that gentle spirit that had always been too pure for the harsh world into which he had been born. Margaret died that autumn, peacefully in her sleep. Father Benedict's successor gave her last rites and a proper burial beside Thomas in the churchyard. Her grandchildren mourned her, remembering a kind if sometimes sad old woman who had always had a story to tell and a gentle word of encouragement. At her grave, one of her great-granddaughters asked, "Grandmother had 3 children, didn't she? Mother Alice, Uncle William, and is someone else?" "Edmund," Alice said quietly. She was an old woman herself now, her hair gray, her face lined. "His name was Edmund. He died when he was young, before you were born." "How did he die?" the girl asked with a child's curiosity about death. Alice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know the full story. It was a hard winter. Many children died that year. But Mother always said Edmund was special, that he loved birds, that he had a gentle soul, that God watched over him even when," she trailed off. "When what?" "When things were difficult," Alice finished. "When the world was hard and cruel. She said God watched over the sparrows and the weak and the forgotten. She said Edmund taught her that. At St. Cuthbert's Abbey, Brother Edmund woke that same morning from a dream he couldn't quite remember. It involved a woman with gentle hands and brown eyes, a sense of warmth and safety, a voice singing a lullaby he didn't know he knew. When he woke, his face was wet with tears, though he didn't know why. He rose and dressed and went to morning prayers as he always did. He led the novices through their lessons, tended his birds, performed his duties with the quiet competence that had marked his entire adult life. But throughout the day, he found himself returning to that dream, to the fading sense of something lost, something important, something that tugged at a part of his heart he couldn't quite reach. That evening, as he scattered seeds for the birds that gathered in the monastery garden, a sparrow landed on his shoulder. It sang a few notes, clear and sweet, and Brother Edmund smiled. "Thank you," he said softly to the